Alan Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying the smug certainty of a man convinced of his own superiority. With a dismissive wave of the hand, he scoffed, "Frankly, with a law degree like hers, I'm not sure she even belongs at this table." The words sliced through the studio like glass. The cameras caught it. The audience heard it. And for a split second, the air seemed to vanish. The panel fell silent. The host froze, and millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens, replaying the sting in their minds. Because this wasn't just a jab at credentials. It was a question of worth. It was the suggestion that a black woman from a working-class background, who had climbed every rung through grit and determination, somehow didn't deserve her place beside the gilded names of the establishment. You could see it in his posture, the tilt of his chin, the condescension dripping from every syllable. He wasn't just insulting her degree, he was insulting her existence in that space. For Dershowitz, Harvard was the throne, and anything less was laughable. For Crockett, her law license wasn't a piece of paper. It was proof of a battle fought and won against every barrier stacked against her. The tension was unbearable. The other panelists darted their eyes, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. On Twitter, the clip had already begun to circulate, captions screaming in disbelief. Did he really just say that? But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't rise to match his arrogance with outrage. Instead, she sat still, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if calculating the weight of her next words. The room seemed to shrink, every camera lens zooming toward her face. Viewers everywhere could feel the moment stretching, an insult hanging heavy in the air, a silence louder than the insult itself. And that's when the energy shifted. Because anyone who knew Jasmine Crockett knew this. She had been underestimated before, and every time, the underestimation became her weapon. The stage was set. The insult had been delivered. The silence had been claimed. But no one, not even Alan Dershowitz himself, was ready for what came next. To understand why that insult hit with such force, you have to understand who Jasmine Crockett is and why her presence on that stage mattered in the first place. She is not just another lawmaker. Crockett, a first-term Congresswoman from Texas, has become one of the most distinct voices in the Democratic caucus. Sharp, unflinching, and unafraid to speak in plain language that cuts through the fog of political jargon. She carries herself with the grit of someone who has spent years defending the overlooked and the underestimated. First in courtrooms and now on the floor of the House, her rise has been swift, and that speed alone has unsettled many in the establishment. In just a short time, she has carved out a profile as someone who doesn't back down from confrontation, especially when the stakes involve issues of justice, equality, or dignity. So when she was invited onto a panel featuring Alan Dershowitz, a man whose reputation spans decades of courtroom battles and high-profile defenses, the contrast was stark. For Crockett, this wasn't just another debate. This was an arena where credibility was currency, and every word could either amplify her authority or undermine it. She knew the risks. She also knew the opportunity, and that's precisely what made Dershowitz's remarks so cutting. By mocking her law degree, he wasn't merely questioning a line on her resume. He was attempting to strip away the very foundation of her authority. In a single sentence, he sought to paint her as unworthy of equal footing, a junior stepping into a master's ring. But here's the deeper truth. It wasn't just about her. That jab carried the weight of generations of gatekeeping. It echoed every time a young woman of color has been told her credentials don't count. It echoed every time someone from a working-class background was told they weren't Harvard material. In that moment, Dershowitz's words symbolized something far bigger than the clash of two individuals. This was about power, who gets to wield it, and who is dismissed when they claim it. It was about identity, who is seen as credible in America, and who is told to sit down and be quiet. It was about dignity, the invisible line between arrogance and earned respect, and everyone watching could feel it. Twitter threads ignited instantly. "Did Dershowitz really just say that?" asked one viral post. Another wrote, "This isn't about degrees. This is about who America thinks deserves to speak. That's why the silence after the insult stretched so long." People weren't just waiting for Crockett's comeback. They were waiting for a reckoning. If she backed down, if she stumbled, it would reinforce every stereotype Dershowitz had leaned on. But if she struck back, and did so with composure and precision, It could flip the entire conversation upside down, and Crockett knew it. She had been underestimated before, in law school classrooms, in courtrooms, even in the halls of Congress. Each time, the underestimation fueled her. Each time, the doubt made her sharper. Now, with cameras rolling and millions tuned in, this was the stage where she could transform an insult into a defining moment. Because this wasn't just a jab at Crockett. It was a warning shot fired at every outsider who dared to challenge the establishment. And the way she answered would change the tone of the entire night. Alan Dershowitz is a name that carries weight in American law. For decades, he stood as one of Harvard's most recognizable professors, a man whose lectures drew packed halls and whose legal strategies made headlines around the world. To his admirers, he was a fierce defender of civil liberties, a sharp mind who could bend the law into a weapon for the accused. To his critics, he was something else entirely, a man whose arrogance often overshadowed his intellect, whose alliances with controversial figures revealed more about power than about principle. The truth is, Dershowitz has always thrived in the spotlight. From the courtroom to cable news, he has embraced the role of celebrity lawyer, wielding his Harvard credentials like a sword. He represented household names, from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein, and in doing so, he carved out an identity as both defender and provocateur. In his world, being the smartest man in the room was not just a reputation. It was an expectation. And Harvard, that gleaming brand of prestige, was always the centerpiece of his authority. That's why, when he dismissed Jasmine Crockett's law degree on live television, it wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was the crystallization of a worldview. That legitimacy comes from institutions like Harvard, not from the lived experiences of someone who fought her way into the profession without a silver spoon. For Dershowitz, the hierarchy was clear. There were those who belonged in the upper chambers of law and politics, and those who didn't, and yet his contradictions are glaring. He has spent years branding himself as a defender of the underdog, championing civil liberties even for the unpopular. He has written books on protecting free speech, on standing up for the marginalized, on ensuring fairness even in the most controversial of cases. But when given the chance to respect a congresswoman whose entire career has been built on defending those very principles, he reached for the oldest tool in the establishment playbook, belittlement. This isn't new for Dershowitz. His career has been a dance between principle and power. He would argue passionately for justice, but too often found himself standing beside men accused of abuse, corruption, or worse. The public began to ask, was he defending liberty or was he defending notoriety? And in that tension, his aura of intellectual superiority only grew sharper. He relished the role of contrarian, even when it meant alienating former allies. That's what made the insult to Crockett feel so heavy. It wasn't just Alan Dershowitz speaking. It was the embodiment of every gatekeeper who ever sneered at a new voice rising from outside the ivory tower. He wasn't merely debating policy. He was performing elitism, live and unfiltered, expecting that his stature alone would make his words untouchable. You could see it in the way he delivered the line, casual, dismissive, as though the hierarchy of legal degrees was an unquestionable truth. He believed titles alone could silence a rising congresswoman. He believed the audience would nod in agreement, that the conversation would move on with his authority intact. But here's the fatal flaw in that calculation. Arrogance has a blind spot. It underestimates those who have built their lives not on inherited prestige, but on relentless perseverance. It forgets that credibility is not defined by a plaque on the wall, but by the weight of one's words and the strength of one's convictions. For all his years of courtroom triumphs, Dershowitz had grown accustomed to commanding deference. In this studio, however, he had entered a different kind of courtroom, one judged not by Harvard degrees, but by the raw perception of millions watching in real time. And that jury was not swayed by elitism. They were waiting to see if dignity could stand taller than arrogance. In that moment, Dershowitz represented more than himself. He represented the establishment that clings to credentials as the ultimate arbiter of truth. He represented the arrogance of a system that too often dismisses the voices of women, of people of color, of anyone whose path to power didn't run through gilded halls. And as the silence after his insult stretched, the camera cut back to Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes locked forward, steady, unflinching. The Harvard professor had thrown his weight. But arrogance has a way of underestimating quiet fire. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in a marble hall or under the vaulted ceilings of Ivy League prestige. It begins in the working-class neighborhoods of Texas, where the value of $1 was measured by how hard you worked to earn it, and where success was not a guarantee, but a grind. Raised in a family that knew the meaning of sacrifice, she grew up surrounded by the quiet dignity of people who worked long hours, not for glory, but simply to make sure their children had a shot at something better. For Crockett, that shot came through education. She didn't arrive with a trust fund or a network of power brokers waiting to usher her through the door. Every opportunity she claimed, she carved out herself. She worked nights, studied long hours, and faced down the same doubts and dismissals that so many first-generation professionals know too well. Professors underestimated her. Classmates overlooked her. The whispers were always there. Does she really belong here? But instead of breaking under the weight of those doubts, Crockett used them as fuel. She earned her law degree not as a trophy, but as a weapon she would wield in defense of those who rarely had one. Where others saw lucrative firms and corner offices, she chose the gritty fight, criminal defense, civil rights, standing up for people who were often voiceless in a system designed to crush them. Her law career became a reflection of her roots. She wasn't interested in defending celebrities or currying favor with the wealthy. She was interested in the tenant facing eviction, the protester charged for demanding justice, the mother pulled into court for simply trying to protect her child. These weren't glamorous cases. They didn't make headlines, but they mattered, because to each client, she was the difference between being silenced and being heard. And slowly, through sweat and sleepless nights, a reputation began to form. People in her community knew that when the system bore down on them, there was one lawyer who wouldn't flinch. She became known not just for her sharp legal mind, but for her refusal to be intimidated. That courage is what propelled her into politics. After years of seeing the same injustices play out in courtroom after courtroom, she realized the law could only do so much if the policies themselves were broken. So she ran for the Texas House of Representatives and later for Congress. Each campaign was an uphill climb. She was outspent, underestimated, and sometimes outright dismissed. But each time, voters saw something in her that couldn't be bought: authenticity. When she spoke on the campaign trail, it wasn't in rehearsed sound bites. It was raw, direct, sometimes even fiery. She wasn't trying to impress the political class. She was speaking to the people who felt like politics had forgotten them, and for many, hearing someone like Crockett stand up and speak without fear felt like breathing fresh air. Her election to Congress was more than a personal victory. It was a statement that someone from working-class roots, someone who had built her career on defending the marginalized, could walk into the halls of power carrying the stories of the overlooked. And that's exactly why Alan Dershowitz's insult struck such a nerve. He didn't just insult a degree. He insulted a journey. Every late night of study, every courtroom battle, every sacrifice she and her family made to put her in that chair, all of it was reduced to a sneer. But the audience watching didn't see weakness. They saw a woman who had climbed without shortcuts, who had never once relied on inherited privilege. They saw someone whose entire life was a testament to resilience, grit, and earned struggle. In contrast to the Harvard professor sitting across from her, Crockett represented something deeper: the power of those who fight their way up, rather than those who begin at the top. And this wasn't just political theater. For millions watching at home, Crockett's composure in that moment mirrored their own experiences. How many viewers had been told they weren't good enough, that their credentials weren't impressive enough, that their background disqualified them from a seat at the table? How many had been dismissed by someone with more money, more connections, more access? Crockett's silence in the face of Dershowitz's insult wasn't weakness. It was recognition. She had heard it all before. That's why the moment held so much power. The insult had been lobbed with arrogance, but Crockett's stillness hinted at something else entirely: calculation. She wasn't shocked by the dismissal. She was deciding how to use it. And that decision, she knew, could transform the dynamic of the debate, and maybe even her public image, in a single stroke. Because Crockett was not new to giants. From professors who doubted her to political opponents who outspent her, she had stood across from power before. Each time, she walked away stronger, sharper, and more determined. This time would be no different. The stage was set. The nation was watching. The Harvard professor had drawn the battle lines. But Jasmine Crockett had been here before, and this wasn't her first time staring down a giant. The studio had settled into a strange silence after the initial insult, but Alan Dershowitz wasn't finished. He leaned forward this time, his voice booming with the assurance of a man who had spent decades being deferred to. "You see," he said, "there's a difference between practicing law and truly understanding the law. That's why people like me teach it at Harvard, while people like her—" He let the sentence dangle, his smirk completing what the words left unsaid. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. You could almost hear the audience at home grinding their teeth. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a test of endurance, a slow tightening of pressure. Dershowitz was doubling down, weaponizing his credentials as if his degrees and titles were trump cards that automatically invalidated the voice sitting across from him. But Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to meet the arrogance with anger. She didn't match his volume, didn't mirror the dismissive gestures. Instead, she interrupted him, not sharply, not rudely, but with a calm that cut cleaner than any insult. "Alan," she said evenly, "you can repeat your resume as many times as you like. But the facts don't change." That single line shifted the air. For the first time, Dershowitz blinked. The professor, so accustomed to long-winded explanations, was suddenly confronted with the sharp precision of someone who refused to play his game. The back and forth quickened. Dershowitz tried again, layering his sentences with references to case law, precedent, and his own role in shaping them. Crockett didn't flinch. She countered each point with clarity, breaking down legal jargon into plain, irrefutable truths. With every exchange, the professor's tone grew sharper, while hers grew steadier. The audience watching could sense it. The balance was beginning to tilt. What had started as an insult now looked like desperation. Dershowitz was leaning harder on his pedigree, but with every repetition it sounded less like authority and more like insecurity. And then the insults began to sharpen. He accused her of oversimplifying. He mocked her naive interpretations. At one point he even chuckled mid-sentence, a laugh meant to belittle rather than to amuse. Each barb was designed to rattle her composure, to paint her as inexperienced and out of her depth. But Crockett refused to take the bait. She didn't laugh back. She didn't bristle. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes steady, her voice level. "I'm not here to impress you," she said, her tone almost conversational. "I'm here to tell the truth." A hush fell over the panel. Even the host, who had been nervously shuffling papers, paused. The cameras caught the shift. Dershowitz bristling in frustration, Crockett calm, unbothered, almost surgical in her delivery. It was the kind of tension you could feel through the screen. Viewers watching at home weren't just waiting for her words. They were holding their breath for the moment when the silence would finally break. When Crockett would unleash the counterpunch, they could all feel building beneath her measured restraint. Because this was no ordinary sparring match. This was the slow, deliberate unraveling of arrogance. Dershowitz had thrown his weight around, and for a while it seemed unshakable. But now, the weight was beginning to collapse under its own pressure. The professor's smirk had vanished. His interruptions grew more frantic, less polished. Crockett, meanwhile, was unhurried, almost serene, like someone who had mapped the ending long before the first insult was thrown. The suspense was unbearable. Everyone in the room knew something was coming. Something sharp, something undeniable. And when it landed, it wouldn't just be a response. It would be a statement, the kind that rewrites the memory of the entire exchange. Jasmine Crockett drew in a breath, leaned forward just slightly, and fixed her eyes on Alan Dershowitz. Her counterattack began with just 4 words. Jasmine Crockett let the silence linger a beat longer than anyone expected. It was deliberate, a pause thick with anticipation. The cameras caught her inhale, the stillness in her shoulders, the unwavering calm in her eyes. Across from her, Alan Dershowitz shifted slightly in his seat, the smirk fading into something more defensive, though he tried to mask it. Then, with measured precision, she spoke. "Alan," she said, her voice even but firm, "my law degree isn't supposed to impress you. It's supposed to serve the people who need me." 4 words had set the stage. The rest had landed like a gavel striking hardwood. The room reacted instantly. The panelists glanced at each other, wide-eyed. The host froze mid-motion, pen hovering over paper. And somewhere out in the digital ether, viewers clipped the moment in real time. The video already racing across social media with captions like, "She's not here for him. She's here for us." Crockett didn't stop. She leaned in, voice steady, not rushing, letting each phrase carve into the silence like stone. "You've spent your life teaching theory." "I've spent mine sitting with people who can't afford theory. People who can't afford you. Mothers fighting to keep their homes, kids arrested for standing up for their rights, workers fired for speaking out. That's who I studied for. That's who I fight for." A murmur swept through the studio. The camera cut to Dershowitz. His jaw clenched. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but the frustration flickered. His hand fidgeted against the desk, his posture shifting from dominance to defense. Crockett pressed on, her cadence sharpening. "You think prestige is proof of worth? But let me tell you what real proof looks like. It looks like sitting across from a teenager facing years in prison because he couldn't afford bail. It looks like fighting case after case with no spotlight, no paycheck big enough to cover the hours, no book deal waiting on the other side. It looks like winning those fights because you refuse to give up on people who the system wrote off." The words landed like blows, but they weren't shouted. They were delivered with surgical calm, the kind that only comes when truth is too heavy to be denied. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but Crockett raised her hand slightly. Not in interruption, but in assertion. The gesture alone was enough to quiet the space again. And then she delivered the line that shifted the entire balance of power. "My degree isn't from Harvard, but it came with something Harvard can't give you. Perspective." Gasps rippled through the audience. It was the kind of line that rewrites narratives in real time. The camera panned to Dershowitz, whose face had flushed, the professor's calm unraveling beneath the weight of words too precise to ignore. Crockett allowed herself the faintest smile, not of arrogance, but of certainty. She continued, her voice building momentum. "Perspective tells me that a law isn't just a theory. It's the difference between a child growing up with their parents or growing up in a foster system. It's the difference between a protester walking free or being silenced. Perspective tells me that the law isn't about who teaches it, but about who it touches. That's the work I've done every day. That's the credential that matters." The audience was transfixed. On Twitter, hashtags began to ignite. Perspective over prestige, Crockett vs. Dershowitz, credentials don't define us. Clips of her words looped again and again, each replay carrying more momentum. And as the energy in the room shifted fully to her, Dershowitz's frustration boiled closer to the surface. His interjections grew sharper, more desperate. "That's anecdotal," he snapped at one point, his voice rising. But Crockett didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, calm as ever, and replied, "Sometimes anecdotes are called people. And those people are why I'm here." The line drew an audible gasp from the audience, followed by the unmistakable murmur of approval. Even the host, struggling to remain neutral, bit back a smile. Crockett had turned the insult inside out. What had begun as an attempt to delegitimize her became the platform for her strongest argument yet, that real legitimacy comes from lived experience, from serving those without power, from walking paths the privileged never had to tread. And the longer she spoke, the more the audience could feel it. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a takedown. It was the careful dismantling of elitism, done not with rage, but with composure so steady it was impossible to dismiss. She closed her counterattack with a final, cutting truth. "So if you want to measure my worth by the name on a diploma, go ahead. But understand this. While you were teaching theory to students who could afford your classroom, I was out there practicing reality. And reality, Alan, doesn't care where you went to school." The room erupted. Some gasped, others laughed, a few even clapped before remembering they were on live television. The host tried to restore order, but it was too late. The exchange had already left its mark. The professor who once commanded deference now sat visibly rattled, his composure frayed. The Congresswoman who had been underestimated minutes earlier now stood taller than ever, without ever leaving her chair. It was the mic drop moment no one expected, except perhaps Crockett herself. She had planned it, waited for it, and executed it with precision. The insult had been flipped, the hierarchy reversed, and the narrative rewritten. But this was only the beginning. Because the cameras weren't just rolling inside the studio, they were rolling across millions of screens, and the ripple effect spread faster than anyone predicted. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the clip was already on its way to becoming viral history. Within minutes, Twitter feeds lit up like a wildfire. The hashtags exploded first. Perspective over prestige shot to the top of the trending list, followed closely by Crockett vs. Dershowitz. And then came the memes. Side-by-side screenshots of Dershowitz's stunned face and Crockett's calm expression. Captions mocking the arrogance that had just been dismantled on live television. Harvard just got schooled by reality, one viral tweet declared, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another said, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win that debate, she taught a masterclass in dignity. The clips were everywhere. Instagram reels, TikTok remixes, Facebook shares. The soundbite of her line, sometimes anecdotes are called people, became the latest audio trend. Stitched into videos of everyday workers, teachers, and parents nodding in agreement. But the frenzy didn't stop at social media. Legal experts, many of whom had once written off Crockett as a newcomer in the political legal space, weighed in with surprise respect. A former federal prosecutor admitted on air, her composure under pressure was remarkable. She didn't just counter an insult. She reframed the entire debate about what credentials truly mean. A constitutional law professor added, Dershowitz may have the Harvard brand, but Crockett demonstrated something that can't be taught in a classroom. The ability to humanize the law. The ripple effect widened. Politicians from her own party jumped in almost immediately, offering words of support. One congresswoman tweeted, "This is why Jasmine is such a force. She doesn't back down, and she doesn't let arrogance define the conversation." Even some moderates, normally hesitant to pick sides in such media moments, quietly acknowledged that Crockett had shown unusual poise for a freshman lawmaker. Commentators filled evening shows with replay after replay. Clips were slowed down, analyzed, broken into still frames. Pundits debated the symbolism. Was this the passing of a torch from the old legal elite to a new generation rooted in lived experience? Was it a cultural shift in how America defines authority? Viewers knew the answer before the experts finished debating. The response online told the story clearly. People weren't just cheering Crockett because she won an argument. They were cheering because, for once, someone who looked and sounded like them had stood toe-to-toe with the establishment and refused to shrink. She hadn't needed to shout or insult back. She had used calm conviction and in doing so, had turned the tables entirely. And then came the celebrity voices. Actors, athletes, and musicians retweeted the clip with admiration. A well-known hip-hop artist posted, "Sis bodied a Harvard professor without raising her voice once. That's power." An actress tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett reminded us that experience is a degree too, and it's one you can't buy." Each share amplified the story further, pushing it from a political debate into mainstream culture. It wasn't long before late-night hosts joined in, turning Dershowitz's flustered expression into punchlines. One joked, "That wasn't a debate. That was a free seminar, and Alan Dershowitz just audited it." The audience roared, but beneath the humor was the recognition that something had shifted. This wasn't just a viral clip. It was a cultural moment. And yet, through all the noise, Crockett herself stayed remarkably measured. While others dissected every second, she didn't gloat or spike the football. She let the clip speak for itself, her silence amplifying the dignity of the moment. But those close to her hinted she had one more thing to say. One final note that would lift the moment from political skirmish to moral statement. Because it wasn't just a debate moment. It had become a national conversation about elitism, about who gets to speak, about the power of earned struggle against inherited privilege. And while the country debated, one truth remained: Jasmine Crockett herself had the last word. Section 8. The resolution moral lesson, 700 words. When the storm of reactions had settled into a steady roar, Jasmine Crockett finally spoke again. Not in the clipped cadence of a courtroom, not in the fiery tempo of a campaign rally, but in the calm, deliberate voice of someone who wanted to leave no doubt about what mattered most. "Credentials don't define truth," she said plainly. "Character does." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatized. But the simplicity of the words cut deeper than any rebuttal. Viewers who had been glued to their screens felt something shift, as if the entire debate had distilled into a single, unforgettable truth. Crockett's message was bigger than the clash with Alan Dershowitz. It was bigger than law degrees, resumes, or televised panels. She reframed the entire incident as a mirror held up to America. How often are voices dismissed not because of what they say, but because of where they come from? How often are credentials used as shields to protect privilege, while silencing those who have lived the realities that laws are supposed to serve? She turned what could have been a personal defense into a universal lesson. Every time someone tries to measure your worth by a piece of paper or a title, she said, remember this: dignity speaks louder than arrogance. Resilience weighs more than privilege, and no degree in the world can substitute for truth spoken with conviction. The words resonated because they weren't abstract. They were lived. Crockett had sat in the trenches of the justice system, fighting for clients who didn't have the luxury of prestige. Her calm composure wasn't just a debate tactic. It was the culmination of a life spent proving her place in rooms that were never designed for her. In that way, her heroism was not in delivering the sharpest insult or the loudest retort. It was in refusing to be shaken, in choosing stillness over spite, in showing that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, strength simply waits for arrogance to collapse under its own weight, and then answers with clarity. Commentators would later replay her closing words again and again, not because they were flashy, but because they captured something timeless. They spoke to workers told they weren't management material, to immigrants told their accents disqualified them, to students told their schools weren't good enough. Crockett's victory was their victory. Her dignity was their dignity. The cinematic close came not in noise, but in silence. After she spoke, she didn't rush to add more. She didn't fill the air with repetition. She simply stopped, hands folded, gaze steady. And in that silence, something rare happened. The country stopped talking long enough to feel the weight of what it had just heard. In that silence, people realized that courage doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes, courage looks like calm. It looks like refusing to bow to arrogance. It looks like holding steady when others try to shake you. And in the silence after her words, the country saw what courage looked like. Section 9. Outro and Call to Action. 300 words. Alan Dershowitz thought a jab at Jasmine Crockett's law degree would diminish her. Instead, it became the spark that revealed the hollowness of arrogance and the power of calm conviction. What began as an insult ended as a masterclass in dignity. Her stunning reply didn't just silence a critic, it inspired a nation. Because in the end, this wasn't about one debate or one clash on television. It was about what we value. Do we measure worth by the weight of a resume or by the strength of character? Do we place faith in titles or in truth spoken with integrity? Tonight made the answer clear. Crockett showed that dignity defeats arrogance every time. That resilience outshines privilege. That courage can be quiet, but when it speaks, it cannot be ignored. Her words will be remembered not as a soundbite, but as a reminder. Power built on ego crumbles. Power rooted in character endures. And now the question turns to us. What do we do with this moment? If you believe in standing tall when others try to silence you, if you believe that truth deserves a voice no matter where it comes from, then share this story. Let it ripple beyond this screen. Subscribe to this channel for more moments where truth wins, where dignity triumphs over arrogance, and where the courage of ordinary people reminds us of who we are at our best. Because these stories aren't just headlines, they're guideposts for what kind of country we choose to be. Dershowitz had the title. Crockett had the truth. And in the silence after her words, the whole world saw who really stood taller.